Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are tackling a really complex topic, Narcissistic Personality Disorder, or NPD. Now, clinically, we're talking about a pretty specific pattern of grandiosity, a constant need for admiration, and a real lack of empathy. But the big question is, where does it all start? We're going to go deep into the science behind this, looking at that intricate dance between our biology and our life experiences. All right, so let's get right to the heart of it. This is the big question, right? The one that psychologists have been wrestling with for decades. Is a narcissistic personality something you're just born with, or is it something that gets made by the world around you? You might be thinking it's one or the other, but as it turns out, the research shows it's way more complicated than that. It's not a simple case of nature versus nurture. It's an incredibly complex origin story where our biology and our childhood experiences are woven together. So let's be super clear about this. What this means is that no one is born a narcissist. It just doesn't work that way. Instead, someone might be born with a certain genetic vulnerability that, if it runs into the right or, the wrong kind of environmental triggers, can then lead to these traits developing. Okay, so let's start with that first piece of the puzzle, our genes. Let's dig into how our biological blueprint can lay the initial foundation for this personality. So how in the world do scientists figure this out? Well, they have this incredibly powerful tool called twin studies. By comparing identical twins who have the exact same DNA with non-identical twins, they can start to tease out just how much of a trait comes down to our genes. And what they found is, honestly, it's pretty staggering. Get this. These studies estimate that somewhere between 40 and 60% of the differences we see in narcissistic traits from person to person can be chalked up to genetics. That's a huge piece of the pie. Now hold on. This doesn't mean there's some kind of single narcissism gene you can test for. Nope, it's not that simple. What we're talking about are genetic influences on really complex brain systems. Things like how we regulate our emotions or how sensitive we are to praise or rejection. It's linked to key brain chemicals like dopamine and serotonin. But remember, that's still only about half the story. Genes might load the gun, but they don't pull the trigger. So let's look at how a child's environment can shape that genetic potential. And what's wild is that it often happens in one of two very, very different ways. And this is where things get really fascinating. Because the research points to two paths that look like complete opposites, but can end up in a similar place. On one side, you have the child who is basically worshipped, put on a pedestal. And on the other, you have the child who is emotionally neglected or abused. Both can be incredibly damaging. Let's zoom in on that first path for a second, this whole overvaluation thing. Solid research shows that when a kid is constantly told how special and superior they are, and that praise isn't tied to any real effort, they start to believe it. They develop this deep-seated conviction that they just deserve special treatment. And that, right there, is the core of entitlement. Okay, so we have these outside influences, either being put on a pedestal or being ignored, but how do those experiences actually get inside and become a fundamental part of someone's personality? Well, there are a few major psychological theories that give us a pretty good roadmap. Before we go any further, there's this one crucial idea we have to get our heads around. It's called empathic mirroring, and it's absolutely vital for healthy development. It's basically when a parent sees what a child is feeling, sadness, joy, frustration, and reflects it back, like a mirror. It sends the message, I see you, your feelings are real, and they matter. So a psychoanalyst named Heinz Kohut had this really powerful theory. He argued that when that mirroring fails, when a parent just can't see or validate their child's inner world, the child feels, invisible. This directly ties into that neglect pathway. And to protect themselves from that awful feeling of emptiness, they build a defense, a grandiose false self designed to go out and get the validation they never got at home. Then you have Otto Kernberg, who looked at it from a slightly different angle. He focused on what happens when love is conditional, when you're only loved for your good grades, or your looks, or your athletic achievements. This can happen in both pathways, right? The child learns their worth isn't inherent. It's split into all good or all bad. This creates this constant painful swing between feeling grandiose when they succeed and feeling completely worthless when they fail. And that brings us to our third perspective from Alexander Lowen, which really drills down on that abuse and neglect pathway. He suggested that for some people, the key childhood experience is just chronic, crushing shame and humiliation. To survive that pain, they build a powerful mask, a persona of superiority and total control, to make sure no one can ever make them feel that way again.
Okay, so we've talked about genes and we've talked about the environment. Now, let's put it all together and see how these two forces don't just act side by side, but actually interact in this really dynamic way.
And if there is one thing you take away from this explainer, let it be this. Predisposition is not destiny. A genetic vulnerability doesn't mean anything is set in stone. There's an old saying in genetics that just nails it. Genes load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. It's that interaction that changes everything.
Think about it like this. Imagine a child who is just born with a more sensitive temperament. That's the genetic part. Now, if you place that child in a really critical or emotionally cold environment, their built-in sensitivity is going to amplify all those negative experiences. They're probably going to be hit much harder and be more likely to develop defensive narcissistic traits than a less sensitive kid would in the exact same house.
But here's the thing, and this is so important. Even when the conditions are really tough, the story isn't over. Research shows the incredible power of what we call protective factors. Just one empathetic person in a child's life, a grandparent, a great teacher, a coach, can act as a buffer. They can provide that validation and emotional safety that's missing at home and literally change the trajectory of that child's life.
So, where does all this leave us? Well, understanding the complex origins of who we are is huge. It's the first step. But it also raises this really powerful question for our future. If our past laid the foundation, what is our capacity right now as adults to start reshaping it and to build something new?